Hello and welcome to the Science of Learning question and answer session. I'm delighted to be welcoming back Professor Paul Howard-Jones from University of Bristol and Professor Tim Jay from Loughborough University to answer your questions from this course run. We're going to start off with a question from Vivi. Why does cognitive load theory say that presenting the same information in multiple forms produce a redundancy effect where the same theory promotes the modality effect? So Tim, would you like to have a go at that question first of all, please?
Yes, so one thing to say in this area with cognitive load theory and how it's kind of being implemented in the classroom and how it contributes to good design is this is a really active kind of research area, and so people are developing new ideas about how to use cognitive load theory all the time and what it really means for teaching and learning in classrooms. One way that I think is helpful to think about this is how time makes a difference. So quite often when we're thinking about the effects of cognitive load theory on how we should be designing teaching and learning, we need to think about what we're giving children to think about at any given moment. So if we're giving children lots of different kind of resources and lots of information in lots of different modalities all right now, then that can create an overload for children. They've got too much to deal with in interpreting each of those modes and making connections between them. And so, we can't know and we can't be sure that their attention is where we'd like it to be. So if we're presenting the information in multiple forms all right now in this moment, then that can create that redundancy effect and cause those problems associated with overload. Whereas if we're thinking about, how we present information to children and give children activities to do over time, then it can be helpful to introduce more different modes and presenting information in different ways because of the multisensory aspects that we talked about during the module, that it's really useful for children to have access to different representations of a concept, so it becomes more flexible and more applicable for them in different problem situations. So I think that's a key thing for me in thinking about how to implement these ideas, is to think about how you're doing it over time. At any given moment, you don't want to be overloading children and giving them information in lots of different modes to think about. But over time, you want to expose them to different kind of representations of concepts and different ways of thinking about the information, so that those become more flexible concepts.
Paul, did you want to add anything?
I suppose, yeah. I mean, I can imagine that there's quite a bewildering array of these theories, these cognitive theories for teachers, and in a way, because I can understand that there is some sort of confusion about them. I think the bottom line is to remember that there is, is to understand this idea that information has to be held in a relatively constrained working memory capacity, and that's the basis of the redundancy effect, essentially, that irrelevant information can be really unhelpful because it's just a distraction, essentially. And what is distraction? Well, it means that we are holding information in our working memory that's not relevant for the learning. But life is never that simple, is it? And on that basis, you could say, well, and some scientists are saying, well, if you're learning to read, you shouldn't have a reading book with lots of pretty pictures in it, because that's just going to be, well, that's the redundancy effect, essentially. That's going to be interfering with your working memory. But then, the argument against that is that actually that can be really important for emotional engagement in the first place, for picking up the book and actually having a look at it. So you have to be careful about anything which is like very prescriptive and saying, you must do this. And I think what we're suggesting is really that just a basic understanding of working memory in terms of that limited capacity to hold information in your conscious attention is the place to start. And that, yes, that does suggest that conciseness is really important, and avoiding too much irrelevant information. But we also emphasize this idea, as Tim's just mentioned, of linking together different representations. and supporting children in linking between those. And that's when I think you start asking about things like, well, is that like with the modality theory, the modality effect, which is basically saying you should present words as speech rather than on-screen text. Is this what you're talking about? Is this the same thing? But that's actually more about working memory. But it can also be the case that making these links over time is really, really helpful for learning. So that's, we're trying to emphasize that at the same time. And then there are other theories like dual coding theory, which is a little bit different to cognitive load theory, since it's more about sort of long-term memory. And that's saying, well, you have different storage areas for visual and verbal memory. So you should basically encourage people to store it in both areas, because that means it's more likely to be recalled. And I mean, that's kind of what we're saying, but in a very sort of gross way, because actually we're not just talking about two representations, one visual and one verbal. We're actually talking about multiple representations that use all these modalities. And in fact, the interesting thing about dual coding theory is that it says, if you look at the research, then it's only been held up as actually useful for learning if the students, the learners, are focusing on making links between the two representations. So it comes back to that again. So I would say, this is my personal prejudice, is just to focus on this idea about limited working memory capacity and think in those terms, and the importance of making links between representations. Because I think as you begin to learn more about the brain as well, I mean, one of the things that one learns is the fact that reading and listening uses the same speech circuits. So that's actually a reason why not to represent text visually and also be hearing information verbally at the same time. So it's better to understand the underlying processes that are involved, rather than to simply be applying these theories, of which there are very many, because I think you can sort of get into trouble like that. that's my personal opinion.
Thank you, Paul and Tim. I mean, that's a really useful answer to the question there by Vivian, also by Joanna. I think that's going to help quite a lot of people actually make sense of how to approach these theories, of which, as you said, there are many. Our next question comes from Helen on bilingualism and actually the evidence related to bilingualism. And Tim, you've had a look at this.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on bilingualism or bilingual advantage. So when I saw the question come in, I went and had a look at the literature and the research that's been done in this area. And again, I mean, like my answer for the previous question, I think one thing to say here is there's lots of research currently going on around this. So over the last 2 or 3 years, people are working really hard on research in this area. So there aren't a huge number of kind of settled questions, if you like. There's quite a lot of debate still about what's going on. And a lot of the research is showing that some of the findings that we did have, looking at where there might be bilingual advantage, may not be as certain as we might have thought they were. And so the evidence at the moment is really quite mixed. So one study I had a look at was by researchers called Morton and Harper, and they were showing, based on meta-analysis and additional analysis of previous studies that had been done, was that some of the evidence that there's an effect on cognitive control. So that's our kind of executive function abilities and our ability to decide where we're paying attention and to switch attention from one place to another, kind of things like that. So research previously that had shown there was a bilingual advantage for cognitive control disappeared once they controlled for things like social economic status and ethnicity. So this is one of the key problems with bilingual research, is that we're dealing with people from very different contexts. People who have grown up speaking different languages, on the whole, come from different parts of the world and different cultural backgrounds. And to actually see if the bilingualism itself is responsible for any difference in other aspects of cognition means that you need to take account of these other things, because maybe it's more to do with where you grew up or how rich your family is, these kinds of things. So Morton and Harper found that a lot of the effects on cognitive control disappear when you account for some of these other factors. One other issue that seems to be a hot topic at the moment is how much the effects that have been found for bilingual advantage are a result of publication bias. So I'm not sure if this is something we mentioned a huge amount in the module, in the course. But publication bias is a problem that we get in lots of academic research, in that more exciting studies tend to get published than studies that have been carried out that don't show exciting outcomes. So in the past, studies that have been done where people have found a bilingual advantage, that's been more exciting for journal editors to publish in their journals, whereas research that's been done in the past that hasn't shown a bilingual advantage, that has found that bilinguals and monolinguals tend to have the same kinds of abilities, people think that's pretty boring and it just doesn't get published. So that's why the research in the past may show there's an effect of bilingualism on other aspects of cognition where maybe there isn't one. So I found a study, another meta-analysis by Leighton et al. In 2018, showing that before they corrected for potential publication bias, the analyses showed a small bilingual advantage for inhibition, shifting, and working memory. So the same kinds of measures of cognitive control. But when they did control for publication bias, all those advantages disappeared. And so their conclusion was that the evidence that's available at the moment probably doesn't give much support for bilingual advantage. So the main answer is it's a little bit messy and complex. One other thing I found, because I know I've gone on for a bit on this answer, was there's been some other meta-analyses that say it depends quite a lot on which language you're bilingual in. So there have been some studies where they found some bilingual advantage for phonological awareness, say with Spanish and English speakers, but actually there was a bilingual disadvantage for Chinese English bilinguals. So there may be some effects, there may be some differences between bilinguals and monolinguals, but they seem to be, if they are there at all, seem to be very sensitive on the particular task that's used to measure different abilities, the languages that are involved in the bilingualism, and the age of the participants and so on. So my conclusion at this stage would be that there's not a huge amount there that we could actually action in design of teaching and learning, but it's probably an interesting area to follow. And certainly if you're interested in methodologies around meta-analyses, there's loads of examples to look at.
Thank you very much, Tim. That's a hefty piece of research you've done there to look at that. That's a great response and a very complex answer, as is life generally, I suppose. Our next question then, it comes from Alejandra on what approaches there might be to consolidate knowledge in online asynchronous lessons. And there's also reference there to English as foreign language students. Paul, would you like to provide some suggestions for Alejandra?
Yeah, I mean, I'm like Tim. I'm not an expert in language teaching, but you know, again, this, as we've mentioned during the course, this is really a case of encouraging the learners, the students, to be representing the knowledge in as many different ways as they possibly can. So looking for different contexts in which they can apply them, you know, whether it's reading magazines or having conversations or quizzes or ordering things in a restaurant, or I mean, all of those sorts of things are quite common in language courses, but the diversity is really essential in terms of developing these multiple representations of the language knowledge and learning to apply it in lots of different ways, which then helps you transfer it to novel contexts. I think many of us are struggling with this issue of asynchronous learning, and how do you make sure that people are actually processing the information and applying it. So I put in quizzes as well, and make sure, I do check the answers and all that, but the reason I do it is not really to, it's not really so much, there's a little bit of checking up, because I do like to know that they've actually been doing the session, but the cheating actually could be quite helpful. But I mean, because if by cheating we're talking about recognizing that you might not be 100% confident about this answer, so you're going to go and look it up and find out what it is and check it, then that is encouraging, a set of metacognitive processes in terms of monitoring your learning, and then prompting yourself by looking at the correct answer and then applying it in the question, writing it down. And so I think if you cheat enough times, that's going to be quite good for your learning, if it's in that sense. I mean, obviously that's different from cheating, where you just take somebody else's answers and just cut and paste them straight in without thinking. But if you're working on your own, I think most of us are at the moment, so we're limited. We can't, I suppose we can send each other the answers. That's not very helpful. But if we're actually just going to our books and finding out what the answer is, rather than trying to recall it spontaneously, then I think actually that can be quite helpful. That's my that's my approach anyway. And I mean, people have to want to learn, don't they? And if they really don't want to learn, and they're going to go to some bizarre lengths to try to obtain the answers to these questions, then that's up to them. But I think one of the issues there is to make sure it's low stakes, so that they're not worrying about getting the correct answer, but they're more worried about finding out what the correct answer is.
Paul, can I just clarify? You're not advocating people actively cheat, but
No.
there's a recognition there that if you are having to look up the answer, then the students need that metacognitive ability to recognize that they don't know the answer.
Yeah, I mean, when you test yourself, when you test yourself and you've got a list of words, this is how I used to sort of learn my language a lot, and I would try to remember them without looking, but then I couldn't, so I had to peek a look. That's actually really helpful, I think, and that's a good way of learning, because you're actually monitoring your learning at the same time. But you could call it cheating, but
and the challenge is obviously for the teachers, where they need to see what those gaps in knowledge are. And so if the student is cheating in a test, then the issue is that the teacher doesn't know that there's that knowledge gap there.
Yes, I don't think there's going to be any online substitute for that, as far as I can see. I mean, really, you do need to have a face-to-face conversation, or you're talking about assessment under much more security than we can easily obtain at the moment.
Absolutely. Tim, any further comments on Alejandra's question?
I think doing this asynchronously is really challenging for all the reasons that you've talked about. I just think I'd emphasize Paul's point about making the kind of testing as low stakes as possible, and reducing the barriers as much as possible to students actually taking some time to think about this. So one of the things that I do, if I'm pre-recording lectures for my students, is just intersperse my talk with lots of little points where I want students to do just a very small amount of thinking. And I'll say something like, right, I'm going to pause the video. You have to think about this question, come up with an answer. I'll be back in, then start the video again. I'll be back in a few seconds with my answers. And if you're doing it in that way, then mixing it up, then students have to engage with it in some way. Just by posing a question, as long as they're listening to the video, they've heard the question, they need to decide if they're going to pause the video or not. Hopefully they do. But if you're just asking for a small amount of thinking every now and again, that can hopefully be a little bit more effective than having a whole block of teaching, for hours of video, and then giving them some work to do somewhere else. So actually interspersing it, and I find for me that just reduces the barriers and reduces the stakes. I've got no way of knowing if they're doing it or not, but it just means they've got lots of smaller opportunities for thinking spread out through the lecture.
The other thing I do is to actually record their first attempt. So I find out, I give them multiple opportunities to correct them. So they nearly always get 100%, but I actually do record what their first attempt is as some sort of indication of where they were before they started cheating and trying to get the answer correct.
I think actually there are some techniques that we use in the actual course, the Science of Learning course on FutureLearn. So breaking, if you look at the course structure, everything's broken down into short chunks where there's a bit of content, might be a video, but we tend to have that pause for thought or that discussion prompt at the end of that little bit of information, which goes back to what you've said, Tim, and following what you've said there, Paul, about the first attempt. In some of our other courses where we've got quizzes, you can have as many attempts as you like, and then the feedback that we provide is dependent upon their response. So if we know that someone said they've selected one answer out of 4, we know that the reason they've selected that answer will be because of a particular misconception, and then our feedback can address that misconception. It doesn't give them the right answer, but it gives them the next step in that learning chain to choose another possible answer if we've addressed that misconception. So there are a few techniques that we've used on the FutureLearn courses that might be things that you've experienced as well, Alejandra, that you can draw upon too. Our next question comes from Lisa, who works with summer school tutors who only teach short courses with no set syllabus, limited teaching experience. So really engaging with learners for a very short period of time. What are the key messages and practical suggestions that Lisa can provide to those tutors?
It made me think a couple of things. I think, first of all, it's an answer I quite often give in these Q&As at the end of the course, is that the important thing for me in this situation is to really work hard to find out what students already know, because the best kind of teaching and learning is always starting from where students are. So if you know where students are right now, then that can help in decisions about what to do next. So certainly towards the beginning of those short courses, I'd be thinking about what can I do as a tutor to find out where students are and what's going to be most useful for them to help them move on. One way to think about doing that, and it depends so much on the subject and the topic and the ages of the students, which we don't know from the question, but it can be really useful to look for or develop tasks which we call low threshold, high ceiling. So these are tasks where all students can access the tasks and start to come up with an answer, but there's space within the task for more able or students that are already familiar with this kind of topic to take it further. So I'm in maths, so maths is more my area. There's Enrich, have lots of useful articles on this kind of thing. They describe low threshold, high ceiling tasks as offering an opportunity for everyone to get started and everyone to get stuck. So they're quite a useful tool to use at the beginning of a course like this to kind of gauge where students are, because they can all do something, but depending on how familiar they are with the topic, they might take it further. So they have lots of examples on that site, and you can find them other places for different topics. But these kinds of low threshold, high ceiling tasks have some kind of investigation element, so you can gauge a bit where your students are and where it might be best to take them next in a short course.
So what we've found in teacher training, because we've put these science of learning concepts into teacher training, and we've been doing that for a number of years now. And what we find in teacher training, because I'm thinking of that because you're saying, Lisa, that these tutors don't have much experience. Is that right? Yeah, limited teaching experience. And so what you tend to find is that new teachers, they focus very much on themselves, not on their teaching, which you might think was a good idea, but they don't focus on the learners. And I think that's one of the things that you're going to have to focus on, and thinking of ways in which you can support your tutors in thinking about the learning of the students and encouraging the students to process the information, because the typical thing is that the tutor will be doing all the work for the students and not encouraging the students as much as possible to process the information themselves. And this is also kind of linked to a sort of a self-consciousness, I think, that many of us feel when we first start teaching, that we're very concerned about whether we are looking and sounding like a teacher. So we go into sort of transmission mode and start piling on the information to reassure our students about how much we know, and actually that's not really what it's about. It's about encouraging them to process and understand and learn the information. But I mean, the good news is though that the Science of Learning course that you've just done is actually quite helpful for this, because we've done some research recently that's demonstrated this. We were able to sort of measure the extent to which teachers were performative in their thinking about teaching. In other words, the extent to which they were thinking about their knowledge, and about how, you know, their sort of status of authority in the classroom and all the rest of it, and the extent to which they were thinking about the underlying learning processes. And exposure, just an hour and a half of exposure to the sorts of concepts that you've been studying for several weeks, but just a little bit of exposure can actually reduce that performativity, that sort of over focusing on your own actions rather than thinking about the learner. So I think that's quite good news, and I would certainly encourage you to really do things that encourage the tutors to think about the students' learning, because it's by no means an assumption, a good assumption to think that they're going to be coming in thinking about that, I would say. And the other thing, just to say, this research showed is that actually over the years of experience, that focus on your performance does actually reduce. So the Science of Learning sort of accelerates that process of reduction, if you like, and gets people thinking more about underlying learning processes, which is bound to be good for the learner.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Tim. We also have a suite of courses on assessment for learning, which look at some of the techniques that you can actually use in class to find out what your students know and where they're starting from. So they might also be very useful for you. Our final question comes from Amy, who would like to know what resources that are available to talk about brain plasticity with students. Paul, I think you've got a suggestion as a starting point.
Yeah, I mean, there's not as many resources as there should be in this area. So I spend a lot of time developing resources and communicating to teachers, and I've always got this project that I never get round to, which is communicating to the children and the students. It's always on the back burner, you know, so there's not a lot out there. But I think the one site which is 100% reliable in terms of the information is Neuroscience for Kids, and that's a Washington-based site. So that's definitely got loads of resources, loads of images. In terms of the information in, you know, which is nicely chunked in terms of easily digestible, you know, messages for children, it's actually very, very good, and you can rest assured that what you're saying is 100% sound. So I would recommend you to that site, I think.
And just while you've been talking, I remembered there's another site that I talked about on a previous running of the course, which is it's a collection of resources that's been put together by researchers at Stanford University who were involved in some of the original growth mindset work. So that's got a new website now at mindsetkit.org. And that's specifically got materials for teachers and for parents about how to introduce children to ideas about growth mindsets and brain plasticity and all. So I'd forgotten about that one earlier, but in the back of my mind now, I knew there was something that I think Carol Dweck and Joe Bowler have been involved in developing those. So that might be worth having a look at.
I mean, you might also want to look at the Centre for Educational Neuroscience in London. My friend Michael Thomas has developed quite a friendly site there on understanding how the brain learns. And also, there are videos on our site, Science of Learning. I think those videos are quite, I think it depends on the age of the children, of course, but I think those could also be quite helpful. I think, I mean, a site that I think I would recommend you to go to if you're interested in teacher education in this area, or teacher training, is the site that we developed, which reports on our attempts to introduce Science of Learning into teacher education. And there are resources there for teacher training as well. So that's yet another website. Now this one is slightly older than our Science of Learning website, so it's not quite as glossy, but it's got, I think it's got reports that will tell you the plan that we took to implement it into teacher education in a research informed way, and some of the outcomes, and it identifies some of the challenges and what we did to address those. You know, things like linking up with Vygotsky and Piaget and traditional ideas about learning, and in terms of linking it up to specific curriculum areas like history and geography. You can download resources from there as well.
Thank you very much, Paul. Much appreciated. Thank you both to Paul and Tim for their responses for today's question and answer session for the Science of Learning. This video will, of course, be uploaded onto YouTube and the course on FutureLearn. So thank you very much for your participation in the course and your questions, and we hope you've enjoyed it.